Welcome to the online panel, State of Play. Where are we in establishing the employer pays principle as normal practice, and what more needs to happen? This session will explore initiatives and improvements to recruitment and also look towards the future to assess what more needs to be done to consistently implement the employer pays principle, or EPP. Thank you to IHRB for including this State of Play session in the lineup today. I am especially pleased to be here because Labor Mobility Partnerships has been working on this topic ourselves across different corridors. As part of our goal of creating better job opportunities for 500 million workers from low-income countries by 2050, we are grappling with the same challenges as our panelists. Namely, how do we implement more responsible practices while also attaining scale? I am pleased to be joined by three very knowledgeable panelists who will walk us through their experiences, lessons learned, and the approaches they plan to take in the future. Here we have Ben Bostock from Impact, Hannah Newcomb from Stronger Together, and Tom Smith from Walmart. The question that I've asked Hannah and Ben to address first is, what is the most important progress towards implementing the employer pays principle that you've seen over the past 12 months? Specifically, we'd love to know what you have personally been working on to put this principle into action. I'll introduce you, Ben, first and ask you to start the conversation, and then I'll move over to Hannah. So Ben Bostock is a principal consultant at Impact Limited. Impact is an employee-owned consultancy that specializes in ethical trade and human rights. Ben has led teams to deliver forced labor, modern slavery, and worker welfare investigations in Europe, the Gulf, and Asia, and provided consulting support and training in remediation of issues, including for Top Glove in Malaysia and for the Supreme Committee of Delivery and Legacy in Qatar for the FIFA World Cup. He will touch on different mechanisms and approaches to implementing the EPP. Ben, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, Alicia. Great question to begin with. And I think there's a couple of angles. So firstly, at the kind of broad spectrum, the greatest progress I think that we're seeing is actually down to the advancement of legislation at the national level and international level. This was starting with the US CBP using the Tariffs Act to start to enact WROs. And then the knock-on effect from these things was definitely seeing companies put under WRO and have to take action to get these modified. Other companies then watching this in the news would, of course, then it would incentivize them to improve their prevention mechanisms for prevention of recruitment fees. These laws then being enacted and copycatted in other countries. You think, Canada's doing something similar, in the EU as well. The more that this happens, the more progress we're seeing based on those legal regulatory requirements that are coming into play. But I know you also asked about the sort of the more micro level and what we've been doing ourselves to work on this issue. So at Impact, we've been helping a number of companies to do various things at the policy level, the procedure level, and of course, working that into practice. What we've been primarily doing is encouraging companies to work on open tenders for their recruitment agencies. So instead of just having the same recruitment agencies that they use time and time again, which have led to problems in the past, we're kind of, encouraging them to scrap the books, start again with an open tender, have that open to everyone so that the companies can compete with one another in an open and transparent way, these agencies. And we want to see the agencies breaking down the costs of recruitment, the different elements required in recruitment, so that the companies assessing the tender, so the companies that we're working with directly, when they assess the tender, they can actually assess the different itemizations of the recruitment, what it should cost, whether the different elements of it are indeed the right elements. They can use various different sources to see whether those are the right elements that they've costed at the correct price. So it shouldn't be overpriced. It certainly shouldn't be underpriced, because that could be indicative that they're going to then recoup those costs from workers. And just having those transparent points of comparison is really, really helpful. What we've also been encouraging them to do is to extend their grievance mechanisms to candidates during recruitment, and to also require their recruitment agencies to share that information with candidates during recruitment. So then, when the candidates have any questions, any concerns, when they just want to know anything at all during their recruitment process, hey, I've been approached by this actor asking for this payment for this purpose. They're saying it's for a medical fee. Is this legitimate, or should this have been covered already? So that the candidates having access to that helpline really assists the whole due diligence process.
Thank you, Ben. I'm really interested to hear that you are implementing what I would call, it sounds a bit like an auditing process into the tenders. And I imagine that requires a lot of in-depth knowledge and gathering about the kind of data that you should be getting. And I'm curious about how that works, but we'll leave it there for now. And maybe we can incorporate some of more information about that as we move on. And from here, I'll move to Hannah. Hannah Newcomb is the co-CEO of Stronger Together. Stronger Together is a not-for-profit that provides businesses with practical training, resources, business services, and collaborative programs in order to create a world where all workers are recruited responsibly and have fair work, free from exploitation. Hannah has been working to provide a range of guidance, training, and resources specifically focused on implementing the employer pays principle and eliminating worker-paid recruitment fees. She will speak today about the seasonal workers scheme of the United Kingdom as an example of how to practically move towards an EPP model in a context where national law and national commitment to the UN Global Compact on Migration are potentially at odds. Hannah, please take it away and let us know what you're working on and what you've seen change over the last year or so.
Thank you, Alicia, for that introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to share some perspectives in today's session. So Stronger Together, we work in multiple countries around the world, but today I wanted to focus on some specific practical examples from the UK, where, as you said in that introduction, Alicia, implementation of the employer pays principle has proven to be particularly challenging for businesses because we see these challenges in the legislation not matching up with some of the commitments. So in the UK, in most cases, when it comes to recruitment fees, as defined in the ILO General Principles and Operational Guidelines, it is illegal for workers to pay those fees. But for related costs, in most cases, it is legal in the UK for migrant workers to incur those costs. So we're talking about things like the cost of visas, visa processing, and transportation costs between countries. So in other words, the UK law is at odds with the employer pays principle and the ILO definition of recruitment fees and related costs. The UK government demonstrated its support for the employer pays principle back in 2018 through the Principles for Tackling Modern Slavery in Supply Chains. That was alongside Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. And it reiterated its support in its modern slavery statement. It's also, as he said, a signatory to the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which includes provisions around prohibiting recruiters and employers from charging or shifting recruitment fees or related costs to migrant workers. So there does seem to be this disconnect between UK law and the government's own commitments. And what that means is that there's no statutory requirement for businesses to cover these costs of recruitment within the UK, and therefore it has to be a voluntary decision to do so. And we do have in the UK a number of UK retailers that have signed up to the employer pays principle through the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. And what we've seen is specifically in the UK seasonal workers scheme that significant concerns were raised last year around some migrant workers on seasonal worker visas taking on debt to come to the UK, including debt to cover those costs of recruitment, so the visa processing and the transportation. And so there have been significant discussions over the last 6 months, really, and more recently kind of formalised through a multi-stakeholder seasonal worker scheme task force, which we are the secretariat for. So within that, there have been discussions around implementing the employer pays principle specifically in the UK seasonal worker scheme, which is just for UK horticulture, as well as later in the year for some seasonal poultry. So at Stronger Together, we support the employer pays principle and clearly recognise the risk faced by workers of going into debt to migrate, and particularly in this context of a seasonal worker visa, which is for 6 months, a 6-month visa, and there's actually no guarantee of 6 months work within that visa. So those costs workers might be incurring are potentially not for a full 6 months of work. But we also recognise that it needs constructive dialogue with all parties in the supply chain alongside worker representative organisations in order to make progress. And we have seen some signs of progress in the last few months. So I think broadly there is willingness amongst businesses to make progress towards the employer pays principle, but wanting also to ensure that that's sustainable for all parties in the supply chain. We did some very initial analysis on the cost of implementing the employer pays principle in the UK seasonal worker scheme, which had multi-stakeholder input. So very roughly, because these were initial calculations, for a grower to take on those costs would be about a 400% increase in the cost of recruiting the worker, which then roughly equates to around a 3 to 6% increase in the price they would need to sell their products on to the supplier or onto the retailer, which may not sound like a lot, but the feedback from growers that this is challenging on their current margins. So the conversation is now kind of moving on to where those costs can be assumed within the supply chain if there's broadly consensus that they need to shift away from workers. And we are now looking at, can we do some research with some more sophisticated economic modelling to actually support those buying companies to have those necessary discussions with the commercial teams, because it has to get to those commercial teams, to understand what those implications are. We have also seen policy and worker representative organisations raising the employer pays principle with the government. And there's also ongoing work to draw up country by country comparisons of countries with seasonal agricultural schemes which do apply a model much closer to or akin to the employer pays principle, to try and have that evidence base to show, well, can it work and is it working, an employer pays model in a seasonal agricultural scheme in other countries. So there is lots of progress happening, but still some way to go. And I would say right now, most and indeed potentially all migrant workers currently entering the UK through the seasonal worker scheme are paying those upfront costs to enter the scheme. Just quickly to finish on where we have seen some ethical recruitment on an employer pays model is in the skilled worker visa route in the UK. So that's an immigration route that has also been associated with significant risks of unethical practices, but where we have also seen some pilots where employers are covering the full costs of recruitment on an employer pays model. I think the differences are that in that scheme, the skilled worker visa allows up to 5 years of work and the ability to settle permanently in the UK. So that potentially means employers see covering those costs as more of a long-term investment and therefore more kind of viable economically for them. So some progress that we're seeing, but more to further to go.
Thank you, Hannah. That is so interesting. I was reflecting on the economic analysis you did, and it sounds very valuable, given that I think sometimes we think about this principle and it feels like people think that the capital to cover the costs will just come from thin air. And so when we look at an industry like agriculture that has such thin margins, understanding that this results in a 3 to 4% increase in price to the consumer is actually really important, because the whole system can collapse if we see a price change like that. And so knowing that you're looking at different routes and different levels of skills where higher margins might result in different designs is very interesting. And I hope you'll share more as you build more information about this, because it's I haven't seen a lot of work on that. And I think it would be helpful for everyone to understand the results of these studies and these designs that you're building. So you ended on some challenges, and I'll use that to parlay the conversation over to Tom to talk a little bit about the challenges that we've been seeing. So the question that I'll have for you, Tom, is what's holding us back from a full implementation of the employer pays principle? Would love to hear about the barriers to adoption by current employers, and looking into our future, where do we think that we may need to start tackling some of those barriers to reach a scaled job placement? And so moving to Tom, I will introduce Tom as the Director of Government Affairs at Walmart. He is supporting the business by managing for geopolitical risk, sourcing, sustainability, human rights, and relationships with multilateral organizations and the EU to help us understand some of the barriers that we need to overcome in this space. Tom, given your focus on government affairs, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say here.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alicia, and great to join everyone at this event. Yeah, I mean, I should very much echo a lot of the points kind of being made. I think just to add to the first question, I think the point that Ben made about legislation, we have seen fantastic progress with that, but there's a lot to be done. So let me get onto that in a sec. But I guess the first point, there's no doubt that there's a huge amount still to be done. But I think if we look back, certainly Walmart and the Walmart Foundation have been involved in this topic kind of since its inception. There has the awareness raising of this topic, it's been immense. I know there's still a huge amount of detail to work through. We're kind of hearing some of these kind of key challenges that Hannah was bringing up now with the current kind of environment. But, it's good to look back and see some, progress, and certainly the awareness and the understanding of this topic area. It was kind of 5+ years ago. A lot of these talks were just trying to explain what it is and what everyone was trying to do. So we kind of need to see some kind of positive progress in that regard. But yeah, I guess on in terms of kind of the full implementation, it's a big question, but I'll kind of pick away at it, certainly probably more from the kind of government affairs point of view. And I think it's first worth pointing out for those of you kind of relatively new to, maybe some of the audience be kind of relatively new to this topic, it's these kind of human rights issues are kind of complex and the result of quite broad systematic issues, including deeply entrenched either sort of economic practices, workers lacking knowledge, support, or tools to safeguard their risks, and this kind of inconsistent government regulation and enforcement. We kind of heard about it a minute ago across multiple different countries. So I think it's really, really important, and I'll get back to this in a minute, for all companies and all governments and all NGOs to be working together on this. Unlike some issues, there's no one kind of entity is going to really be able to kind of fix this. So I think the two big pieces on this, and we can maybe come back to it on the role of business, but I think the critical element is going to be around kind of aligning government standards and aligning kind of international standards on the kind of global standards piece. So I think particularly from a government point of view, we're hearing Hannah about some of the issues in the UK, and certainly from our perspective, we're looking at this in a variety of different supply chains. The sort of cross-border nature of this issue requires this increasing dialogue between governments. You might even have kind of between governments or between regions, and this kind of variety of international frameworks and laws and policies that can potentially improve the lives of workers. So I think it's really critical. Certainly, we do a lot of engagements with different government organizations to kind of encourage new systems, new controls, and the enforcement of either existing laws, because sometimes that's the issue. It's just, it's not about creating something new, but about actually just enforcing something that's in place already. And I think it's really important for other companies, not just Walmart and others, but a whole variety of kind of NGOs and governments to put pressure. And I think it's through this direct conversations and collaboration with governing bodies of sending and receiving countries. It's trying to kind of encourage these strong labor laws and systems for inspection, the greater enforcement of laws, and a whole kind of bunch of different areas. So it's really kind of critical to get that piece on. And I think it's also, and this kind of pulls into this kind of international piece, is about governments also working together on the international kind of regulations. We've seen a whole bunch of different kind of pockets of activity. We had this engagement and still do with the Bali Process, with Bali Process Government, a business forum. We've had a variety of discussions within the UN. There's been some interesting output from the kind of US EU Trade and Technology Council, kind of where forced labor came up last week, I think it was, or this week. I've lost track of my diary. But I think it's critical that these international forums can come up with some consistent regulation that can then be transposed into kind of national pieces. Because I think whilst we're seeing, there's going to be individual circumstances in each country. We're kind of hearing from Hannah about the issues in the UK, but creating these kind of global standards and global regulations that each country can draw down onto will help companies like ourselves roll out policies that can be consistent across all these different markets. Because the challenge here is that if we see different pockets of solutions and framing or guidance that are entirely different in each country, certainly for brands like us, but others, it's very difficult to scale single big solutions and big commitments if you're seeing all these different kind of mechanisms dotted around in different markets. So I really think this piece around this kind of international coherence on kind of mechanisms and guidance, and there's a lot that's been done on this already, but there's a lot more that can be done on that piece. So yeah, certainly kind of global standards and kind of how governments work on these, both in terms of their domestic policies and the kind of international forums. But yeah, just some initial thoughts on that.
Thank you, Tom. What a great point about how difficult it is to roll out policy in the context of so many different regulatory frameworks. I cannot imagine how difficult that must be. So I wish you luck with getting everybody aligned and putting some pressure on folks to get on the same page so that we can actually move forward to build solutions at scale. Ben and Hannah, I'm curious about the challenges that you're seeing. Ben, why don't you start off with what you're seeing from where you sit?
Sure. And yeah, just to echo Tom's points, super important for governments to be working together on these things, bridging between national and kind of international good practices. Because what we still see a lot of, sadly, and some of the investigations that we get involved in at Impact will be around or will, at least involve elements of corruption, elements of kickbacks. We're constantly seeing, deals with recruitment agencies and companies themselves, whereby, even if they're not paying directly and there's not money going on the books directly to these companies, instead it will be coming in the form of kickbacks, where the company's HR representatives will go and visit these recruitment agencies in their home country, be put up in 5-star hotels for weeks on end, be wined and dined, business class flights, these kind of things. So there's so many ways to get past the to sort of pay back in kind, even if it's not going officially on the books, that we're sadly still seeing, whilst awareness is rising about these things. And you kind of think about as well, there is generally more knowledge that these things are going on, and the ILO's definition of recruitment fees of 2019 is certainly helpful at making various players more aware of the normality of those kind of things and how to watch out for these things. We're also still sadly seeing, government to government agreements in recruitment, which I'm sure Tom you'll struggle with and know all about. But some of these government to government agreements to do with recruitment still very much allow and propose for fees for the charging of recruitment, because it's still seen as a commodity. It's still a big business. There's so many different players making their money off the recruitment of workers. And so, you think Malaysia to Bangladesh through 2016 to 2018, this was, hugely profitable government to government agreements, which took so much money off so many workers. And the costs of recruitment fees during that period was just astronomically high. But we're still seeing those kinds of government to government agreements now. And there's a case that we're working on where, a company has had to apply for workers through its own government. And then that government is the only one that can kind of approve the recruitment of migrant workers. But the arrangement it has with the sending country, with the workers' origin country, is to charge $8,000 per worker to get those workers across. And that's purely at the government level. And so we're still very much having to deal with those kinds of issues. And, it's very difficult for us as Impact. We're a private company. It's not necessarily like we can work on those kinds of cases at that scale. So that's certainly an impediment to progress that we're seeing and having to grapple with.
Thank you, Ben. That sounds like an enormous impediment to grapple with as a private company, and I can understand how you would have limited reach to be able to influence it. Hannah, how about you? What's your experience with the challenges that we're still facing now?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I think just building on what Tom and Ben have said, I think the other challenge is those illicit and legal informal parties that seem to be kind of proliferating within the recruitment process, both in sending countries and also in destination countries, but those that can kind of infiltrate the legitimate supply chain. And I know that the businesses in the UK, particularly within the work that we're doing in the UK seasonal worker scheme, but we do see this in other processes, are finding that a real challenge where we have individuals or illicit brokers that are targeting workers before they enter that formal recruitment process, already charging fees, and then workers are already indebted when they're coming into or accessing the job advert for the first time that's legitimate, that kind of first legitimate point in the recruitment process. And I think it was interesting, Ben, what you were saying earlier around the importance of grievance mechanisms within the recruitment process as well as the employment process, which we'd absolutely agree with and we kind of promote within our guidance. But the concern is that, and what we've heard actual examples of, is workers fearing raising the issues during the recruitment process because that they fear that they won't be selected for work, where if they raise it later, perhaps they have a greater chance of accessing remedy. So I think that is something that businesses are kind of grappling with, certainly here in the UK. I think what's holding back on this issue is, effective enforcement of those illicit and criminal actors, remediation for workers that have paid those illicit fees. And we know on that question of remedy and responsibility for remedy, again, that's proven to be a real challenge to get organisations to agree to take responsibility for actions of brokers or individuals that have no formal supply chain link with them. And I think, echoing what Tom and Ben have said about the importance of those government to government agreements, I think those including, the actions that are being taken around enforcement of those acting criminally and illicitly is a key part of that as well.
Thank you, Hannah. It sounds like we're experiencing many of the same things in our agricultural corridor between Mexico and the United States in terms of worker indebtedness and trying to get real information, real data, and grievances systems set up to ensure that people can safely report and safely share their truth. It's a big challenge that we're facing as well. So moving on from the challenges, I'm hoping we can take this to a place of solutions and hopefully focus the second half of the conversation on some inspiration for everyone about what do we see going forward, how might incentives or solutions that are on the horizon, even if we haven't solved for them yet, help us move forward. And so in yesterday's keynote, my colleague Rebecca Smith shared that millions of visas in many receiving countries around the world are going unfilled because of the barriers that we're talking about. So employers and workers facing excessive costs in migration systems or not having access or knowledge about what could be available to them. And in particular, we find that companies that have never used a labor migration channel, so new entrants into the system, are really likely to need some extensive support in order to navigate these systems. There's a lot of complexity on the regulatory level, visa processing. They have a lot of fear about what does it mean to take responsibility for people coming from other countries to make sure I do everything properly. And where they're just starting out, we've found that sometimes employers may find that paying for all worker-related expenses to be quite difficult. Maybe talking just about recruitment, but there's also training and other costs that accompany recruitment in many cases. And so it's not just cash flow limitations, but sometimes just facing the uncertainty of adopting a new approach that requires significant investment feels like a lot of risk to employers. And so we at LAMP have been working on ways that we could find business incentives to help employers and supply chains embrace more of the employer pays principle, and also thinking about sharing risk and sharing value along the value chain. So I'm very curious personally to hear what you've learned and see what we can learn from each other about how we can incentivize employers in this case to take on more risk and to take on more of the cost. Keeping in mind, as Hannah, you said from your first comment, that this expense doesn't come from nowhere. It does trickle up and it trickles down to everybody. And so what's the best way to share these expenses? Ben, do you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the incentives, just to kind of echo what Tom was talking about before as well, one of the greatest incentives is still going to be the stick rather than the carrot. So greater government legislation and greater enforcement of that as well is going to be hugely important here, because in our experience, that's what companies are constantly worried about. That's what they're constantly asking about whenever we visit them. Is what do we have to do? It's still that is still very much the case for the vast majority of the companies. The fear of the kind of big bill of remediation of a recruitment fee repayment, that is becoming bigger and bigger, with the cases you think like Top Glove and Sime Darby, these kinds of cases where you're into the tens, even, Top Glove was $40 million plus in terms of that big bill for just the recruitment fees repayment, let alone everything else that becomes a cost in remediation of wider forced labor issues. Those big bills, actually, on the remediation side, those then also incentivize the improving creation, expansion of policies and procedures to prevent reoccurrence in the future. So actually, even though it comes from a sort of, more stick place rather than a carrot place in the first place, that creates the incentive ongoing, both within the company itself, but other companies, other peers will then watch that and, are then acting independently and are fully incentivized to act on prevention as a result of these things. And, if you're looking at what happened in the all across Malaysia, particularly with the rubber glove sector, largely because of companies that were placed under WRO and acted accordingly. There were companies very much just independently doing the same kind of work, and they were very much incentivized to do that, even though there was no kind of WRO placed on them. They just knew that there was that kind of potential threat, and so they were naturally incentivized. So that just really indicates how powerful though that legislation can be if it's enforced correctly, but also how powerful the knowledge of how big a bill could potentially be, to make sure that they're then putting in place employer pays principle and various preventative mechanisms in future. The other thing I would like to mention as well is helping companies to cover the costs associated with recruitment, because companies are more and more realizing just how many different elements, how many different itemizations there are to the recruitment of every individual worker, which can sometimes be an eye-opening process for the companies as we work through this with them, because before it may well have been that they just paid a flat rate per worker and didn't really see where the money went. So just knowledge of how much this can actually cost. Thinking about that, we can also think about, could there be some form of kind of working capital fund that companies pay into that they can then access to cover, so that recruiters can use this fund to cover recruitment costs at the recruitment stage, because often it's the availability and the liquidity of access to money that can prevent a barrier to doing this properly. One thing that Impact has been working on for the last couple of years is the remedy bond. So the idea that that different companies can pay into a central bond that can then be accessed. It's primarily the first use and the first trials are going to be for repayment of recruitment fees. But if these go successfully, this sort of bond can definitely be used for access to this kind of working capital as well, for the actual recruitment process to help recruitment agencies and to help companies to ensure that the costs of recruitment are covered. And the idea of this kind of bond is that, it's kind of managed by a financial institution. Those that pay into it can be, it can be brands, it can be the companies themselves. And there is just this accessible pot of money that can then be repaid. But what it means is that there's never that barrier to actually accessing the money in the first place. But yeah, I'll pass back over.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like that's a great solution for when timing is an issue or liquidity is an issue. And it helps move things forward in terms of creating a mechanism or an intermediating force that can allow us to overcome some barriers. Hannah, what is your thought? I know you probably know a lot about the remediation bond as well. And what else are you seeing that's interesting in terms of overcoming barriers?
Yeah, I think, adding to what Ben said there around effective legislation enforcement and the kind of financial mechanisms, I think thinking about supply chains specifically, there needs to be those clear market signals from all parties. So employers that are, moving to the employer pays principle, that they've got that market signal from their buyers, that they are committed to that's actually translating into commercial buying practices at each stage in the supply chain to support the implementation of the employer pays principle. So transparent costing, at each level in the labour supply chain to ensure those full costs of recruitment, overheads, and a sustainable margin, so that it is a sustainable practice. That's other purchasing practices like good labour planning and reasonable lead times, because we know that where that's not in place, then that can have a knock-on to the impact be felt by the most vulnerable workers. Long-term contracts, strategic partnerships between buyers and suppliers, and between suppliers and recruiters, just to kind of have the systems to support the employer pays principle being commercially sustainable within the supply chains. I think as well, without legislation in place to level the playing field and to move beyond the early adopters, I think businesses also want to be able to demonstrate the commercial benefits of implementing an employer pays model, where on paper it may seem more expensive. So I think understanding the true cost, as Ben said, so that true cost may be higher than the business thought, but actually it's often lower than what workers are currently paying, particularly if steps can be taken to sort of formalize the recruitment process and remove costs that are actually unnecessary, that workers are paying, and other steps to minimize costs, things like organized transport, that we have seen kind of pockets of good practice to bring that sort of unit cost per worker down. Understanding how the costs can be fairly distributed across the supply chain, as we've said. And then I think broader evidence of the wider business benefits of an employer pays principle approach. So starting to gather that evidence of improved worker satisfaction, reduced risks to the businesses, and that ability to differentiate on the basis of responsible recruitment. So that's something, for example, through our Clearview scheme for farm labour contractors in the US, we've supported those organisations to be able to differentiate on the basis of responsible recruitment credentials. And I think those kinds of initiatives, we've got the IOM with their IRIS scheme that have been doing similar work on cross-border recruitment to enable those that are seeking to go first on these recruitment standards to get that recognition. I think finally I would say support for further education, information, and support for workers to understand their rights and entitlements, identify what those ethical recruitment opportunities are, and then access remedy where they've paid fees and costs. We work with Just Good Work. They're a partner of ours. They've been doing some great work on this in countries around the world, including in the UK seasonal workers scheme.
Thank you. You said two things that I want to pull out of your note here, which was, one is long-term contracts between suppliers and buyers. I thought that was interesting, and it's something that we've seen a lot of as well. As a challenge right now is that often, especially in sectors like agriculture that are very much a commodity, it's really a labyrinth to know who's in the supply chain. There are a lot of different actors involved, and it's difficult to make long-term commitments when you're not entirely sure who you're committing to. And one piece of hope that I see here, which is part of a conversation we had with one of our corporate partners recently, was that there's a lot of work being done to map supply chains for carbon footprint and for climate sustainability. And it feels like there's a lot of resource being put behind that effort and a lot of enthusiasm for it on the public's part. And so all of that mapping work may be able to be repurposed and recycled into more transparency that we can use in the human rights sector. Maybe I can ask you if this is something that you've seen, and if not, we can move on. But I'm curious about your kind of success in helping build these long-term contracts between suppliers and buyers, and any hope that you might see in changes in terms of transparency in supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, I do think on the transparency piece, we've seen those challenges, and we've seen them being, different in different sectors and different countries around the world. So I would say in the UK, there are reasonable levels of transparency down to the grower level, and now starting to move, through the recruitment supply chains as well. So I think there's been progress made there, and then that does support businesses to then work towards those longer term contracts. I would say the progress on that side of things is perhaps catching up a bit, but certainly in other sectors that we work in around the world, that transparency piece is really challenging, and I think that is a key starting point in order to then work on developing those longer term partnerships within supply chains.
That's great. It's a worthy effort to be making. And the other thing that you said that rang a bell for me was coming back to Ben's discussion about being able to differentiate between costs. So I won't ask you to speak more to it, but just that this is a theme that's coming up, is educating employers and educating people along the supply chain to know what should things really cost, what should recruitment actually cost, and what are the itemized expenses there. So that keeps coming up again and again, and I think it's worth calling out because you've both mentioned it. So Tom, I'll pass it to you and ask what kinds of business incentives, especially sitting in a corporate seat, you could see as being particularly interesting to help employers get over the hurdle of moving towards the employer pays principle. And they may be hurdles of willingness, or they may just be hurdles of timing or structure of the way that payments work. But I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I'll just build on what everyone said already, I think, because it's kind of completely aligned. I think the key for us, Hannah, you put it really well with the clear market signals. I think that was a kind of great point, because we need other companies to step up to this as well. It's not, we made the big commitments back in 2016 for this to be a huge kind of focus area for the business. And the Walmart Foundation put a lot of money behind it as well, and there needs to be these other market signals. There has to be a greater level playing field. I think both we a lot of talk about the legislative piece, but it's essential to have other businesses step up as well, because that will make our lives easier in rolling this in our supply chain. Because the problem is we've made these big commitments, we put a huge amount of kind of brand and actual kind of cash investment in this, but if other major retailers or other brands don't make the same commitments, that's incredibly challenging for us as well. So I think just purely put, trying to get other companies to make these big, bold statements, I think obviously legislation is going to be a big incentive to that. You've got market reputations as a big incentive for that. But, Alicia, you were talking about, the parallels with the climate world that we obviously work really closely as well. That's to see that's just, all of the activity on that is expected practice. There isn't, everyone's expected that the bar is set pretty steady there. And anyone that isn't reaching that kind of minimal level is kind of really called out. It would be fantastic for this topic and this issue to reach that same level of recognition where just this is expected practice. This isn't some philanthropy or some extra program or whatever. This is just something that companies do as part of day-to-day compliance. That's the aspiration. And we need other companies to kind of step up and help push this forward. And at that point, the whole kind of market will move from that point. And we're not there yet. I mean, that's the reality that we're all hearing. If there's only a few companies, even if they're the size and scale of us, you need all these other companies to also step up, either voluntarily or through legislation. And it kind of snowballs from that point. So I think really encouraging other companies to kind of step up in the same way that Walmart has, I think is going to be really critical for this.
So now we need an economist on the panel to tell us how to manage this game theory of the situation, right? What is the chicken and what is the egg? And how do we get everybody to move forward at the same time? I will not ask you to answer that question. I think it's a little bigger than we can tackle in this format. But I want to change gears a little bit right now and move over to thinking more specifically about the worker and the worker's experience. One of the things that we're really concerned about with LAMP is thinking about how growth as growth in the labor mobility industry has the potential to put more control in the workers' hands, because the more opportunity that is available to workers, the more choice they will have. And so we actually believe there's an interesting series of things that needs to happen to get to a point where workers can say, well, that sounds like an interesting opportunity, but I'm more interested in this other one. And I'm willing to invest in my future. I want to make certain choices because they work better for me. Here's how I think I would do that. While we have a really constrained system and capital constraints, it's very difficult for the worker to be able to access opportunities because there are so few opportunities that supply demand is just, it's not in the worker's favor at this point in time. And so as we move to thinking more about worker agency and thinking about some of the levers that workers might have to be able to control their destiny, make choices before we actually get to scale, because we think scale is an important end goal or important, it's both an important end goal and it's an important lever. What can we do before we reach scale? How can we give workers more agency in this process themselves? Hannah, I'll start with you and then I'll move to Tom and then Ben, and then we'll have a quick wrap up at the end of that conversation to see if there are any questions that we want to ask. One between ourselves as a group to build on anything that we've said today in the panel. So Hannah, worker agency, I'm wondering what you're seeing and if you have any thoughts about how we can infuse a little bit more of it into our designs.
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of reflections on this. I mean, firstly, in terms of kind of the quality of information that's reaching workers, we've been seeing a lot of concerns about social media and the impact it can have on targeting vulnerable workers with fraudulent job adverts and scams. So I think it's about how can we combat that with, projects that look at using social media as a force for scaling accurate information to reach workers. I think alongside that, we have seen some examples of work to enable workers and migrant workers to rate their recruiters and employers and to get that kind of information out to workers. But I don't know to what degree that's kind of scaled yet. So I think, workers having that agency to kind of be able to look at, the quality and the previous experiences of job seekers and workers when they select the job that they're going for. But I think obviously that relies on workers feeling that they have that agency to select those opportunities. And something we have seen as a challenge in the UK, where we are currently we have significant labour shortages, but we aren't really seeing that translate into, in theory, that should translate to better and higher quality opportunities, but we are seeing risks within the labour market here. We are seeing concerns that labour shortages actually leading to cutting corners, reduction in due diligence. So I think it's ensuring that those conditions are there for workers to feel that they've got that agency to make those choices. And a lot of that is much wider macroeconomic challenges around the economic situation within countries, the impact of conflict, the impact of climate change that we are seeing on workers at the moment. So I think there's a lot of factors that are affecting workers' agency, but I think there is still more work that can be done, at least to get that accurate information out to workers to help inform the decisions that they're making.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That's really interesting. Transparency being so important, and also using some tools that already exist in the market today for employers or customers of in other areas, other sectors, other fields, to deploy those into the hands of workers to give them more of a voice. I think it's a really interesting idea and something that we hope to see more of going forward as we try to move the worker from the seat of the beneficiary, as we might think of them, into the seat of the client, and trying to please the client as the main stakeholder that we're trying to serve in this space. Tom, how about you? What is your experience in Walmart regarding worker agency?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'll build on Hannah's points. I think one of the bits that we're seeing, generate a lot of interest and success is around this information piece. Kind of, maybe it's overly simplifying it, but a lot of the time, we have all been immersed in this topic area and can talk about it, for hours on end. But it's still explaining to workers kind of what brands' expectations are up in the supply chain is still something that needs to be done at scale. And coming from organizations like ourselves, so I think the team, it was last year, I think they put out this kind of refreshed communication on what the kind of Walmart expectation was. Getting those things circulated out can really help kind of break some of this misinformation that exists out there, and for it to be a recognized brand as well. So kind of workers can actually really understand what this topic is, and for them to really understand, what information exists out there for kind of organizations and guidance. So I think it's one of those things that's always been there since the start, this whole kind of topic and agenda, and we mustn't lose focus of some of the kind of simple pieces about just getting the right information out there in the right context, and kind of breaking down some of this misinformation that, as we heard earlier, is only getting worse with some of these kind of bad actors in the supply chain. So it's really important for organizations like us and others just to keep putting pressure on getting the right information out to the right people.
Great, thank you so much. And Ben, I know that worker agency is an important part of the remediation work that Impact has established. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the worker agency side of things, we still find at Impact that there's just no substitute as effective as speaking with workers directly in a human way, one-on-one, or in very small groups in our the investigations and the assessments that we do. And this should actually be no exception. So where workers are being recruited in the candidate process, we would still absolutely recommend that there is some form of touch point in terms of speaking with candidates during their recruitment journey. This can still be on a very small scale, because we know that the scale of recruitment at some companies is absolutely astronomical. So we're not saying you need to hit a certain percentage or you need to get a certain sample size, but at least knowing the various risks in your recruitment chains, you can then target places which will be particularly higher risk of recruitment fees or other forms of exploitation, to have some direct interviews, with third-party assistance, using third-party experts where it's appropriate, or doing it through support with buyers or with other companies even, can really help to humanize the process, rather than relying on apps and surveys and technology and things. It can really help humanize and get the information directly from the workers. I completely agree with Hannah and Tom that the information that workers are receiving about the job role that they will then be doing is incredibly important, because that whole part can just be so misleading to workers, and again also dehumanizing. So what we've seen good practice in the past 12 months has been where companies, and this has been at the more micro scale, but it certainly can be replicated and scaled. But we've seen HR managers, operational managers travel to worker origin countries, go to the recruitment drives themselves, speak about their company, hand out pamphlets on the job role, do an FAQ with the workers, outline the exact recruitment process that is going to take place, the different touch points that they're going to have with different officials, with medical, with security clearance, all these kind of things. So it's all laid out in a very clear pamphlet, and also to hand out their own grievance numbers. So the point I was talking to earlier, we've seen examples where these HR heads would be saying to the workers, this number isn't just a kind of a number in the ether. try calling it now and it will call their number and it's their phone in their own pocket, and they can see that after having met these managers that they will potentially be working for in future, and just building that element of trust to the whole process. So that combined with touch points of actually interviewing workers one-on-one, using third-party experts as it's appropriate through that recruitment process is really essential. Combining that with a robust set of policies in terms of service level agreements between company and recruitment agency, to make sure that it's not only have they signed up for the employer pays principle, it's actually saying, do you also have a grievance mechanism? You can use ours if ours is successful, or we can use a third party one, and building in an actual requirement that they share that with the candidates during their recruitment journey. So it's not simply having one, it's actively sharing it. And that can then be tested through due diligence from when the company is speaking with the workers in these one-on-one interviews that I was talking about. They're actually checking with the candidate, They're checking with the candidate, are you aware of this phone number? Have you used it? Have there been, do you trust it? Do your friends trust it? All these kinds of questions to build in a multi-layered due diligence approach to making sure that these workers, that these candidates have the avenues by which they can ask questions and check on the process, and making sure that they understand the job role that they're going to get. Because we see, deception is a huge concern during recruitment. So a lot of the questions that candidates may be asking may indeed be around, are they even going to the right location, as well as, all the contractual terms that we're talking about. So these kind of avenues of due diligence and providing agency to workers to ask these questions and just make simple checks on things are all critically important.
Thank you, Ben. That is a great point. The combination of worker touch points with the robust standards and mechanisms is crucial. And I think we're seeing more and more of that across all of the different initiatives and collaborators in the space. It's become more common, and also technology is making it much easier now than it was even a handful of years ago. So as a final point, I'll just ask if there are threads from this conversation that anyone would like to pick up on, or closing words that would like to leave with our audience. I know, Hannah, you had some interesting things to say about clients, workers as clients rather than beneficiaries. So I'll perhaps hand it to you first.
Yeah, what you said there, Alicia, just really rang true in terms of the guidance that we promote through Stronger Together as well. So yeah, seeing workers as customers or as clients rather than as the beneficiaries, and promoting that worker-centered culture. So going beyond those effective feedback and grievance mechanisms to sort of truly integrate the voice and opinions of workers throughout recruitment and employment, and then take proactive steps to improve their experience. So getting their direct feedback on how was the recruitment process and employment experience for them, and building that into a kind of continuous improvement approach to responsible recruitment. And yeah, we have kind of practical guidance on that within our responsible recruitment toolkit. I also wanted to pick up on those earlier conversations about, costing out the true cost of the employer pays principle. That initial analysis that I spoke about in my first question, I do want to caveat that that's very much an initial analysis, and that cost of 3 to 6% was the cost from the grower to the retailer rather than necessarily to the consumer. But that analysis has helped to kind of get a starting point of a figure that we can then hopefully explore in more detail with a more kind of robust economic analysis. But I think it has been helpful to at least have a figure to bring those conversations and enable some of the retailers to take those initial conversations to their commercial teams. And I do think that kind of the true cost it is important for us to make progress on scaling the employer pays principle.
Absolutely agreed. And thank you for the caveat and the clarification on the 3 to 6%. That's good information to have. And Ben, I think you had a point around worker agency and some examples, if you wanted to share those.
Yeah, just to kind of add to the points we were just discussing around, making work as a client, not just a beneficiary. One really interesting thing that we found in our 6-year project in Qatar. Impact was visiting Qatar every 3 months, and we've spoken to over 5,000 workers there on worker welfare, based on the worker welfare standards of the Supreme Committee there. There was a huge program there on which we helped the Supreme Committee to develop on repayment of recruitment fees, called the Supreme Committee Universal Reimbursement Scheme. This paid back around 30 million US dollars to workers during that time. What we found is that this kind of communication point with workers is just critically important, and it's evidenced by the workers who were receiving this money without a proper explanation or an understanding of what the money was for, were 10 to 15% less satisfied due to lower feelings of respect, compared with workers who were receiving the same amount of money for the same reason, but had it properly explained through conversations, through FAQs, and who had proper access to these kinds of mechanisms and worker feedback sort of forums. And so that difference is really indicative across that huge worker base, to just show how important that is. And on a more qualitative level, because it's a bit difficult to sort of talk about or measure kind of worker productivity at this scale in the program we were doing. But on a qualitative level, the worker feedback we were getting from that second group of workers who did have this, the reasoning explained behind the payment, and therefore had higher feelings of respect. They were just much more happy to be at their companies. They felt much more respected. They wanted to stay with their companies, compared to, the broad range of workers we were speaking to who might have received this money but didn't know what it was for. They tended to be much more likely to want to move on, to go home, to not want to recommend this job to other people. So that feedback point, it's not just about the money, it's about actually humanizing the workforce, which we found incredibly important.
Thank you. What a great point. Thank you for sharing that with us. Tom, wrapping it up, is there anything that you'd like to add as final words for the panel today?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's a hard one. It's a hard one to follow up on that. It's a great point. But I think just broadly, for those kind of listening and participating in this event, I think this, everyone can see the big challenges that kind of lie ahead, and the importance of big brands like ourselves and others really kind of stepping up and making big, bold commitments that can really help shift the landscape, the industry, influence governments, other brands. I think it's critical for those of you that haven't already stepped up to kind of make a big mark on this issue and show your commitment.
What a great final rallying call. Thank you so much for that. And to our audience, I'll just say that we know many of you have a lot of ideas or experiences that you could also add to this conversation. So I'll speak for myself and our panelists. We'll say, please reach out to me or Hannah, Tom, or Ben to individually share your experiences, your lessons learned, opportunities for collaboration. I think everyone here on this panel today is very open and willing to collaborate and share. And it's been a really nice experience to be here today. And we want this not to be the end of the conversation, but to continue speaking with our audience and with each other as well. So thank you for participating to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for your attention, and to IHRB for the opportunity for us all to get together and speak today. Have a wonderful rest of the event.
So welcome everyone to this session on climate and conflict-induced migration and labour exploitation, understanding the risks and taking responsible action, which is part of the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment 2023, organised by the IHRB and AIM Progress. My name is Louise Herring. I'm Executive Director of AIM Progress, which is a collaborative forum of 45 fast-moving consumer goods companies working together to positively impact people's lives and increase respect for human rights in our collective supply chains. As an individual, I wanted to introduce myself and explain that I'm someone who's worked with companies on business and human rights and modern slavery for a number of years. But I'd also acknowledge that the world is changing very rapidly and that conflict and climate change are having a dramatic impact on so many people globally, on so many people's lives, and exposing them to vulnerabilities which we all need to understand better and know how to respond to. So I'm really delighted to facilitate the panel today and to be joined by 4 experts who can talk about this topic and we talk about what organisations, businesses and individuals need to be doing to manage these changing risks. So I'm going to hand over now to those individuals so they can introduce themselves, tell you why they're passionate about this topic. So I'm going to start, please, with Anna. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Louise. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Trippinell. I'm the founder of Human Level. So a little bit about my background and why I think this topic is incredibly important, and I'm really pleased we're chatting about it. Some of you know that I had the enviable position of leaving the law firm to work with John Ruggie on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And what I speak less about is that in parallel to that work, I was also working as a human rights lawyer in conflict and post-conflict countries based out of Kenya and then Cote d'Ivoire and Libya. And I saw firsthand the connections between climate change, drought, resource shortage and conflict. And even though it was early days in making the connection, anyone who was working on conflict knew that part of the root, of that conflict was the change in climate. And today, I'm working with companies on human rights due diligence and the UNGPs. But really 3 years ago, I had that aha moment working after doing the Cambridge course that all of the human rights issues that I'm working on with companies, all of them will get worse with time because of the rapidly warming climate. So when we say that climate change is the biggest human rights challenge of our time, that is absolutely true. And so that's why at Human Level, we've made it our mission to build knowledge of the interconnections, weekly listserv, content help, all of that for free, as well as working with companies, of course, but really just to get the word out on what needs to happen. So thank you for inviting me to be here today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Yes, my name is Nicole Munns, and I'm a director at Justice and Care, running an international systemic change team. We are, as an NGO, focused more broadly on modern slavery and helping to identify victims and bring about justice and systemic change in the response to modern slavery. But quite specifically, we've been looking recently at the connection between conflict and climate change. Induced migration and trying to understand how it affects modern slavery and the risks it imposes for migrants in that area. I'm particularly interested in this because climate and conflict are becoming increasing drivers of migration. Those that are impacted by conflict and climate-induced migration are already a very vulnerable group, and forced migration heightens this risk. So it's a really concerning trend, something that we need to be really aware of and understand better if we're to respond more effectively. Thank you again to Louise for the opportunity to be here today.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Pablo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Pablo Escribano. I am a regional thematic specialist on migration, environment, and climate change at the International Organization for Migration. And I cover the Americas and the Caribbean. IOM is a UN-related organization with 175 member states, and it was one of the first organizations to really look at the nexus between migration, environment, and climate change, because of member states understood that these trends were going to shape the future of the present and the future of human mobility. And I'm personally fascinated about the very different ways in which climate change and disasters and environmental degradation affect the way people move in our region, right? And there are many diverse ways in which it affects their well-being, but also the way in which migration can offer solutions to some of the major challenges of our time. Thank you very much for having me.
Great, thank you, Pablo. And finally, Rachel, welcome.
Thank you very much, Louise, for inviting me to be part of this. My name is Rachel Rigby, and I've worked for about 20 years on labor rights and human rights in global supply chains, from within the U.S. government first, and then also with NGOs. And like the other panelists, I started to realize over time how important it is not to work on these human rights and labor rights issues in a siloed way, but to really acknowledge the underlying causes of those abuses related to climate change and land degradation so that we can really tackle root causes in a systemic way. I currently lead our human rights work at Rainforest Alliance, which is a global organization working at the intersection of business, agriculture, and forests for over 30 years. We run a global agricultural certification program that reaches about 5,000 companies and 4 million farmers and farm workers. We also implement over 60 projects to complement our certification program in many production and forestry landscapes, working with farmers and forest communities to improve livelihoods and protect nature. Our sectors of focus are coffee, tea, and fruits, as well as some key forest risk commodities like cocoa, palm oil, and forest products. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you to all of our panelists for your introductions. So, Nicole, I'm going to come to you first, if I may, please. Your recent research paper used the term distress, migration, and displacement. So, could you talk us through, from your perspective, how you think climate and conflict is changing patterns of migration globally, and what your research has found in terms of how that is in turn changing patterns of labour exploitation?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Louise. So climate change and armed conflict are becoming increasingly relevant drivers of significant increase in forced migration. So the numbers of migrants forcibly displaced or distressed displacement within and across borders has nearly doubled in the last 10 years, reaching its highest levels since World War II. And importantly, the rate of forced migration due to these factors has significantly outpaced population growth. So it's becoming a bigger problem and is likely to continue for the reasons that I'm sure we'll be exploring together today. This has important consequences for the risk of trafficking and labour exploitation. Individuals forced to migrate due to conflict and climate change come mostly from lower and middle income nations. And they're already living with poor economic conditions, which makes them inherently vulnerable. Conflict and climate change induced migration compounds these pre-existing vulnerabilities, and particularly when migration is entered into suddenly as a result of conflict and climate. Conflict, really the reason why there is that additional area of vulnerability associated with that suddenness and conflict and climate-induced migration is because typically migrants are isolated from family and community networks. They have limited opportunities for income generation in their new destinations, limited access to government support, legal and labour protection in transit and destination countries. And in the case of protracted displacement, which is actually becoming more common, these migrants are more prone to desperation and as a result of the lack of opportunities. So what happens also in instances of disaster, for example, environmental disaster induced by climate change and sudden onset conflict, is that government support and law enforcement systems that even in normal times can be quite stretched, become quickly overwhelmed in these times and leave many of the population unprotected. So there's a number of things that come together to combine to compound already existing vulnerabilities within these low and middle income countries, poor circumstances in which these migrants are coming from. Yet the circumstances of conflict and climate-induced migration compounds and exacerbates all of these risks.
Great, thank you so much. And Pablo, if I can come to you, can you talk to us with your perspective, which is specifically about the Americas? What are you seeing in terms of changes in patterns and changes in exploitation?
Right. Thank you very much. And that was a great introduction to the topic from Nicole. And I guess, I mean, where we come from in the Americas is that migration is often a traditional feature of societies, right? Both internal and international migration. But we do join, I guess, Nicole's approach in saying that, climate hazards in particular, but also environmental hazards at large, affect the way people move, right? And affect the conditions in which they move. The new data on internal displacement was just released yesterday, so this is very timely, and it noted that it recorded 60.9 million new displacements worldwide due to conflict and disaster, right? Which is a very high, I think, the highest figure in the latest years. In the Americas, we're talking about 2.1 million new disaster displacements and 500,000 displacement due to conflict and violence. So we can see that the figures are quite high, actually, right? And in many countries of the Americas, disaster displacement happens over the year because of many different impacts, right? Floods and storms in particular are the hazards that are forcing people to move out of their homes. Human mobility in context of climate change, disasters, environmental degradation is also very diverse, right? It doesn't need to be a disaster. It can also support adaptation. But it is true that, as the IPC says, when there's low level of agency, low resources, low capacities, it has negative impacts, right? And that's where we're sort of joining the conversation on vulnerability, right? It can increase existing vulnerabilities that are depending on many drivers, right? We're talking about the situation of poor communities, rural communities, indigenous communities, specific situation of women and children. So all of these drivers are what creates scenarios in which climate change impacts and disasters exacerbate these difficult situations, right? And we end up with situations that Nicole was describing in terms of displacement, even protracted displacement, where people can or easily fall prey to exploitation, right? Because they have fewer resources, fewer networks to rely on. So what we're seeing is that when there's not enough coping capacities, the adverse impacts of climate change and disasters do increase vulnerability. And throughout the migration or the mobility process or the displacement process, we're seeing increased levels of vulnerability and of exposure to exploitations and other harmful practices.
Thanks, Pablo. And can you give us some examples of practically how you're seeing that through your work from particular countries that you're working in, or perhaps with particular vulnerable groups?
Right. No, that's a very good point. So we have had over the last year very visible cases of massive displacement. Right. We're seeing, for instance, the Caribbean after the 17 hurricane season, Central America after Eta and Iota in November 20. But as I said, this year, what struck me about the last reports is that there's a lot of disasters, smaller scale disasters that are driving displacement, right? In places like Brazil, in places like Colombia, we're seeing, the impact of flood and storms displacing people almost on a daily basis, right? So we're seeing sort of this proliferation of risk that's compounded by limited integration into society, limited access to social protection, and so we're seeing in these places where, for instance, in Central America, displaced people may fall victims of trafficking, or may incur into smugglers because they're such in a desperate state, right? Because they've lost their income, they've lost their livelihoods, they've lost their housing, and they have fewer options for integration in their host communities. So in all of these areas, we're seeing an increase in vulnerability that's exacerbated by climate hazards and disasters.
Great, thank you. And thanks for kind of making that real with some examples. That's really helpful. Anna, can I turn to you now? I'd really like to hear from your perspective. What's your sense at the moment about the approach that businesses are taking towards these changing risks? Do you think that there's sufficient understanding of how much these risks are changing? And are businesses building these kind of longer term timeframes and these more kind of volatile scenarios into the way that they're working?
Thanks very much, Louise. And first, Pablo, wow, what a striking figure. 60.9 million of internally displaced. That's more than the population of England. Really striking. Yes, Louise, well, aware and knowledge, I mean, that's definitely starting, but for that to trickle through into actual processes, that's why we're here to talk about that. So a number of companies, of course, are used to conducting what we call human rights due diligence. In essence, having policies, practices, processes in place that pick up the risks to people in operations, in value chains, and doing something about it. What companies are less used to doing, however, is looking ahead to where the risk to people will be in the future, and then looking to take action now to mitigate those risks. So in other words, what we're seeing is that some of the short-termism that can be baked into human rights due diligence systems, is this a human rights impact today? Is it a severe human rights impact today? Does not equip companies to look ahead and to anticipate how these migration flows will manifest and how they will impact people in their value chain and in their own operations. So what we're starting to do, and Louise, you'll know this well because it came out also very clearly in our research for AIM Progress, is looking at how companies can take a longer term perspective to human rights due diligence. So essentially, what will the operating text look like for my business in 2030? What kinds of risks are on the horizon and will become risks to people then and will become severe then? And how do you do that? You need to bring in new data points. For example, you need to be relying more on science, what we know about the pathways of the future that the world could take. And then you need to be laying onto the science the human rights analysis. How can these pathways manifest into human rights impact? So essentially what I'm saying, Louise, is that this approach, this long-term perspective on salience, existence and severity, coupled with forward-looking scientific and human rights knowledge, together can equip companies to play a role today to mitigate these same human rights issues of tomorrow, which will happen. It's just a matter of time. And we know that companies are better equipped to mitigate them today rather than waiting for them to happen and then trying to do something about it then.
Yeah, great, thank you. Nicole, can I then ask you to build on what Anna's talked about? So your focus is clearly more in agriculture. We would expect to see the impacts of climate change, certainly for agricultural communities, to be greater. So from Rainforest perspective, are you seeing the businesses that you work with really understanding these risks and starting to take action on them?
Yes, absolutely, we are. In terms of the risks that companies face, I think it can be useful to think about them in a couple of different categories. One way of looking at it is the risks that migrants face in sending areas, the areas that they come from, the areas where they live, but they feel forced to leave, and then those risks in receiving areas. So in terms of receiving areas, the agricultural lands that migrants migrate to in order to, oftentimes it's to have decent work or improve their livelihoods. There are really good tools out there to understand the likelihood of a company having migrant labor in its supply chain. So that's something that companies started doing a few years ago, not only in agriculture, but other sectors, migrant labor risks and how to address those. And Rainforest Alliance has a forced labor and child labor risk map, which incorporates information about migration, which we work with Ergon on, and that profiles risks for coffee, tea, cocoa, and bananas. And that's a methodology that's open source and can be adapted to other sectors. So we would welcome anyone who would like to use it or contact me about how to use it. But as Anna was saying, risks related to migrant workers alone doesn't give you that second piece of information that's also vital about what are the causes of that migration, and is it linked to climate change? And if so, what do we need to do about that climate change? There are not a lot of, I would say, well worked out tools yet that get to the level of specificity of really for a company to understand its risks of climate related migration in its supply chains. Deeper analysis needs to be done on that, and I know groups like Human Level are doing that. So that's really good to see that evolution. But there are things that companies can know. For example, in West African cocoa production, it's well known that migrant workers come from Burkina Faso and Mali to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire for the cocoa harvest. And they are among the most vulnerable people in the cocoa supply chain. They are driven by poverty in their home countries, but that also is scientifically shown to be affected. One of the root causes of that is the climate and land degradation situation in those home countries. Another salient issue linked to worker protection and climate change is the reality of wide-scale labor shortages in the sending areas. So simply put, in rural areas that have been heavily affected by climate change, the social protection systems have become eroded, social instability and unrest have increased, there's more violence and conflict, everything that Nicole kind of briefed us on initially. For example, in the coffee sector in Central America, this is really being seen in a way that's really affecting business. So farmers have a diminished ability to make a living. Their lands are increasingly unsuitable for even growing coffee, which leads them to not be able to hire workers or offer worse quality jobs. Workers leave to seek better opportunities elsewhere. Even outside the agriculture sector, they migrate away. And companies are very attuned to this because it affects their sourcing and availability of the crop. Many, companies that source coffee, for example, have been looking at climate risk maps and other projection tools for years to plan their sourcing and channel investments. But many times those kinds of activities don't necessarily encompass the human element. They will maybe look at what investments they need to make sure that they can ensure their coffee crop is available, but not necessarily what happens to those people's livelihoods or the working conditions of workers. There are other things that companies can do to address this, but I think we'll get to that later in the session.
Great, thanks very much, Rachel. I'm going to come back to you, Anna, if that's okay, just in terms of thinking about this. You've talked about what companies, yourself and Rachel have talked about what companies need to do to better understand the risks. You've talked a bit about the longer term timeframes. What do you think a responsible business response looks like to these changing risks? And what do businesses need to be doing to make sure that the opportunities they're offering for people in the receiving countries are decent work opportunities? Where does that start? What would you recommend?
Such a good question, Louise. Yes, what does it look like in practice? What do companies need to do? We described before the fact that human rights risk management needs to be grounded more in climate science and having more that sort of longer term perspective of climate science and how it will impact human rights. And we talked about having a longer term perspective on the risks to people and assessing salience. So that's sort of number one, because of course you need that knowledge. But really, I'm seeing this start to evolve. And I was just reflecting before this, what are really, the elements that you would want to have in place, right, to be future fit for the world of tomorrow today. So what I'm seeing is, human rights and climate need to have a seat at the table for business decisions, including those that are future looking. So we will start to see it, and this will accelerate. We're already seeing it now. Companies want to de-risk, they want to move away from the risk factors, the extreme weather events cost them too much, they want to disengage, and they also want to move away from, if the climate is affecting commodity growth, we will start to have new sourcing strategies. This misses the point of responsible disengagement, and we need to have business, climate, and human rights at the table to look at where business is going and what we can do to bring a rights lens to that business decision making. That's number one. And then number two, companies need to think about the resilience. We've heard a lot, from the other panelists here about the resilience of farmers and workers and community members to climate change. So in practice, what it looks like, and Rachel touched upon a number of those elements already, living wage, living income, collective bargaining, trade unions, tackling discrimination. You can start with migrant workers in countries that are likely to move linked to climate and then sort of go outwards, so you can prioritize. But essentially, what are the actions you can take to build that resilience of the people in your value chain? We know that's not enough. We know that there's an enabling environment that needs to also look at this, and Pablo touched upon this as well. How can the company play a role to incentivize and push for a much stronger enabling environment? A little bit before, Nicole and Pablo, what you were saying, before sort of it gets too stretched, like what can we do now to try and build that enabling environment? Regulation, enforcement of regulation, social security, safety nets. This is where we read the beauty of collective, collaborative, creative leverage in the UNGPs comes in, of how we as buyers can play a role in policy issues that are so important, because our workers and our community members sit within that policy enabling environment. And the last thing I'd just say is sort of taking a step back and connecting this a bit more to responsibility when it comes to the company. This isn't a nice to do. Look, to put it really simply, we are in a system where Western companies have, since the Industrial Revolution began in the 1850s, they've grown. This is part of the economic development, right? But based on greenhouse gas emissions. And we now know that all these greenhouse gas emissions combined are impacting people, a lot of them further away from where these companies are based, and will impact people more and more. And so those who have not benefited from this economic development are those who will be harmed in the most severe way. So, there is reluctance, and I understand why, to tie companies' greenhouse gas emissions to human rights impacts because of retroactive remedy that this might entail. But I think we've got to just be a bit honest here and also think about that future role for companies when it comes to leaning in to play a role for those who will be impacted more severely by their greenhouse gas emissions, alongside, of course, a whole collective, which comes back to the collective responsibility. I don't want to suggest it's an individual one per se, but it's definitely this bigger collective conversation that we need to have.
Thank you, Anna. And I think you paint a really clear picture of what businesses need to do. I think it's interesting whether the mindsets of where they need to be to do that at the moment. I mean, that's part of what I'm really curious about. Rachel, if I can go back to you in terms of that idea of a responsible business response, what would you add to what Anna said in terms of what you think businesses need to be thinking about and be prepared to do in response to these changes in migration and those changes in potential exploitation?
Yeah, thanks. So endorse everything that Anna said. And to add a little bit of color to that, some of the things that we're seeing in the field that we're seeing working really well and are very promising. So one thing that companies can do, of course, is supporting farmer livelihoods through good purchasing practices. This can mean many things, like having stable long-term relationships with suppliers, thereby providing a livelihood stability for farmers in a volatile environment, paying fair prices, and in commodity agriculture, this can definitely mean more than the market price. Another is to support farmers' adaptation to climate change, making the necessary investments in the land to make the farm more resilient. These types of actions make farms more stable and better able to then provide decent work to farm workers. However, of course, that is not automatically the case. So it is really important that when these measures are implemented, they're always accompanied by some form of monitoring of labor standards. In receiving areas, I also wanted to mention, of course, I think in this particular forum, we're all familiar with responsible recruitment programs, and there are many organizations out there that run really strong ones. I'm thinking of labor rights organizations like Stronger Together and Verite and others, one of which we partner with, actually both of which we partner with. And we have a program in Mexico and Costa Rica with Stronger Together, where we're really building deep capacity of farm management and labor recruiters to coach them through setting up responsible recruitment systems and tools. So those are the kinds of investments companies can make in receiving areas where there are migrant workers. I also wanted to mention that companies should really be open to an innovation mindset. There's a lot of piloting happening right now in this whole space of the just transition. How do we bring together these issues and tackle root causes in a systemic way? For example, there are innovative programs around climate mitigation that seek to address climate change and provide decent livelihoods and working conditions simultaneously. We have a program in Cameroon where the community has set up a landscape management board with inclusive membership, women, indigenous people, etc. It makes bottom-up decisions about land use and land protection. And based on the decisions of that board, members of the community, including young people, are being trained to do carbon monitoring and data reporting. So these are jobs with good working conditions in which people feel they are contributing to the community's protection and prosperity. And this gives the jobs to the local people instead of what often happens in carbon monitoring projects is an external, probably global north-based organization will come in after the carbon has been sequestered or the carbon projects have happened and do the monitoring and data collection.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Nicole, I'm going to come to you on this question now. You can give us a slightly sort of different perspective. We've talked about, the responsible business response, but businesses don't, operate in isolation. You've also got the role of government. So from your perspective, how do governments need to facilitate and support and help businesses to react in a responsible way to these the changes in migration and the risks of exploitation?
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I think obviously businesses have a really important role to play, but I think there's a limit somewhat to what they can do if there's not a level playing field. And so we firmly believe, we've done some extensive research on looking at a number of different responses and approaches to addressing exploitation in supply chains. And we believe that governments have a really critical role that will enable businesses to be more effective. So what we're seeing at the moment, there's an unlevel playing field where responsible businesses are playing their part, but find it difficult to compete. And particularly if you throw in additional pressures in the system, like what we're talking about, the impact of climate and conflict, on labour supply, for example, we think it makes it difficult for responsible businesses to compete with those that are not committed to maintaining those standards. So we believe that there's a few key instruments, I think, that governments should be introducing that show the most promise at the moment. And they are, I think, speaking to what Anna said earlier, it's about due diligence approaches, but an enforced requirement to take due diligence approaches very seriously, so that all businesses, not just those that are choosing to be responsible, but all businesses actively identify and address risks of exploitation in their supply chains. And I think also to again, another point Anna made earlier is I think part of that is there's scope to predict emerging trends and to ensure that the supply chains and the processes enable businesses to adequately prevent finding exploitation in their supply chains. The other mechanism, which is also important in our opinion, and it shows some promise, it needs to be well targeted, but the introduction of import bans that prevent products made from forced labour and labour exploitation from entering markets and undermining competitiveness of responsible businesses. So they are sort of two ways to level the playing field and enable these efforts that we're talking about today to actually be effective and not undermine competitiveness.
Great, thank you, Nicole. And we could probably do a whole separate session on import bans and pros and cons with different views, I'm sure. Pablo, if I can come back to you, I mean, from the IOM perspective, do you see, in terms of responses to these risks, do you see businesses, government, institutions like your own, civil society, working together yet on these issues? Do you see an opportunity there, even if perhaps it's not happening yet?
I thank you very much. No, I definitely do see an opportunity and the sort of platforms emerging for this to happen, right? Notably, a call for non-state actors to be more involved in mobility governance stemming from the Global Compact on Migration, but also the work on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? So I do see the platforms emerging, sort of, and we're not there yet, right? I think we're all very clear that we're not there yet, but it's increasing. I would like to also come back to what Nicole was saying, but also on the idea that governments have a role to play also in facilitating movements, right? And the idea that migration doesn't need to be a disaster, right? And we don't need to be reactive, right? I mean, there should be, processes for which people can move in a safe and regular manner, and which would benefit both those affected people and businesses, right? Because they would know they have the information, they have the conditions, right? And Rachel was mentioning Central America, where obviously the movement of labor is important in the coffee sector, right? And there's a important role to play for governments to facilitate movements and to put the conditions for these movements to happen in a manner that benefits all, right? It benefits them, but also governments themselves and the private sector, right? So I fully agree, Luis, that I mean, private and public and CSO partnerships are the way to go in saying, right, I mean, these movements happen, but let's make them happen in an orderly manner that can benefit us all, right? And there's a skill process to be addressed as well. What are the skills that are moving and what are the skills that are needed in both places, right? So all those sort of dialogues are important, and I think businesses have a key role to play in them, also noting that many of them will be themselves affected by the climate crisis, right? And the tourism sector in the Caribbean, agricultural sector in many places will be affected, and yeah, I mean, the labor markets will have to adjust accordingly.
Great, thank you, Pablo. So I'm going to come to each of you for your closing thoughts, please. We could talk for longer, but we're not able to. So a couple of questions. Either talk through your vision and your hope in this area. Pablo, you've taken us into that space of hope, which is great, and given us a positive angle on this, which is brilliant. But either your vision and your hopes in this area, or one step that you'd like to see companies taking. So what's the kind of first starting step, or the kind of main step you'd like them to take? Pablo, I'm going to come back to you if that's okay. I know we talked about the idea of social cohesion, and you had some examples of some really positive, case studies of communities coming together to support migrants coming into their communities as a result of climate and conflict. So maybe you could start there for that kind of vision and hope question for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a positive outlook for the end. But yes, indeed, I think that where we want to take the future is to a more cohesive integration of environmental and climate migrants. We know that to a large extent, migration is happening already, will continue to happen, will be partially driven by climate change, among other drivers. And we want to see inclusive societies, right? Societies where migrants can thrive, where they can contribute to adaptation, they can contribute to development, they have the skills they need, right? So in as much as we're already involved in this, and Nicole was saying this is not a future trend. I mean, this is happening now. But it's important that as of now, we look at preparing future migrants, preparing future cities, preparing future businesses, right? And think about what the future looks like for people to be moving due to climate hazards in particular, right? From rural areas to cities, from coastal areas inland, how that changes the productive phases of societies, right? And how businesses need to adapt. So I do see sort of promise in the sort of forward-looking manner and partnerships, and we're looking forward to having more private sector actors involved in this, I'm sure that governments will be obviously interested in this and looking forward to this cooperation.
Great, thank you. Nicole, then if I can come to you for your kind of final thoughts. I don't know if you can, I mean, your research is very focused on the scale of the challenge in front of us, but is there a vision or, a hope that you have in this area?
It's hard to distill it into one, but let me try. I think some of our broader research shows that these forms of exploitation are actually really hard to detect in supply chains. They have distinctive characteristics that make it challenging. And I think there's a level of alertness and engagement that's required in order to do so. That I think what is helpful in that space and to understand the impact of climate, and specifically going back to some of what Anna said about the specific risks that are quite predictable in lots of ways, looking to the future, that looking at trying to take an industry and sector specific approach and trying to really understand well what the specific areas of vulnerability are in those sectors, I think is a helpful and practical way to make it more accessible and easier to engage with something that is actually quite hard to do.
Great, thank you. Rachel, what are your thoughts on either a one step for companies or a vision or a hope or both, if you can squeeze them in?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we've seen at the macro level in recent years, especially lately, is civil society and other actors calling upon governments to look at the way climate finance is being spent. And so much of it is channeled towards what needs to happen to the land, right? And not enough to what has already happened to people, their human rights and their economic livelihoods, both what has happened and what will happen in the future. So just as we're looking at that, those calls to governments on a macro level, I would say the same thing to companies. When they're looking at how to spend their sustainability dollars or euros or francs or whatever they are, we're seeing a lot of that going into climate mitigation efforts, right? Carbon credits and so on. And not enough is going into adaptation, helping the people have more resilient livelihoods and better human rights, whether they're people already affected by climate change or who will be affected in the future. So that would be my call to the business sector. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. And Anna, your final thoughts for us.
Thank you. Well, first, I love Rachel, what you said before about adopting an innovation mindset. So I want to make sure that's back on the table because it's such a good one. Taking a step back, I just got back from the Cobalt Congress. So I was chatting with a Cobalt trader about these things and, the forward-looking vision of business. And he was like, yes, Anna, it's all well and good, but I'm incentivized for short term. Like, I don't even look further than the week. So, how can I have this long-term vision in my business and my day-to-day, and let alone the business? And let's be honest that this is not how companies are structured. They are structured for very sort of short-term risk management, and we get it. Like, it's very hard to have that longer-term risk perspective, except for some issues where we know for sure it's going to be a business risk. And so we're not saying it's easy, but we're definitely seeing that it's starting to change. And I think just to acknowledge, for those who are listening, that Yeah, we know that taking that longer term perspective is something that could be seen as sort of an add-on, right? Additional work when we're already really busy and scrambling with our day-to-day. And now in addition, we're looking at more risks that are on the horizon. And what I would just say to that is there was a session in Glasgow that really stuck with me, which was about this topic. And the end of it, sort of the facilitator said, look, the reality is that this is the only time where we'll be able to take a rights-based approach to these topics, because every year that goes by, it becomes less and less possible and likely, because we will start to scramble more and more. And if you look at one of those UN figures of sort of 1.2 billion displaced by 2050 out of 9.8, so it's a big percentage, we will be in a very different world. And so the point here is that we can make it short term by saying, if you want to be business in the future, we need to be starting to think about this today, because these are real risks to the business in addition to risk to people and planet. The business case has been made, but for a long-term business that wants to be here in the future, for sure. If you want to be short-term, then it might be harder. But and I think any company, who wants to thrive, they want to be here tomorrow. They want to be here in 2030. So that's what we're saying. If you want to be here in 2030, we're looking at the risks in 2030 and what you need to do today. That would be what I would leave people with.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So thank you so much to our panelists today, to Anna, Nicole, Pablo and Rachel. Thank you for all your ideas. We've had lots of things that definitely I'm going to go away thinking about, how do we not scramble around on this issue, end up being on the back foot when actually we can be on the front foot? How do we start building this into whatever type of organisation we are, start building this into our thinking today, how we're going to deal with these changes in migration, what steps can we take that will reduce exploitation for vulnerable people? And there are things that we can do. And leaving as well with Rachel's encouragement that we use innovative mindsets, and Pablo's call that we look at how we kind of work together. We've had great representation across sectors on today's panel. I've really enjoyed it and hope that you've all got something from it as well. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Neil Wilkins and I lead the Migrant Workers Programme at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Our programme seeks to promote the rights of migrant workers at all stages of the migration cycle. Like many others, however, we of course have a particular focus on how migrant workers are recruited, as we see in all sectors and all locations that flawed recruitment processes frequently sow the seeds of vulnerability that can lead to exploitation. As part of the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment 2023, I'm joined today by Saket Soni, who is a labour rights activist in the USA, working especially for the rights of low-wage migrant workers across the United States. Saket is also the author of a book, The Great Escape, a true story of forced labour and immigrant dreams in America. It's a great book and one that I thoroughly recommend. And I'm delighted to have Saket with me today. Saket, welcome.
Thank you, Neil. Great to be here with you.
Saket, I think the title, The Great Escape, gives us an idea of what your book is about. But perhaps you can give us an overview of the Great Escape and immigrant dreams in America.
Sure. The Great Escape is about how I helped 500 men who arrived in the United States after Hurricane Katrina escape from forced labor and get on a road to justice. I'm a labor rights organizer, and after Hurricane Katrina, I ran a small labor rights nonprofit. This was in 2005. Katrina and the post-Katrina flooding had turned the Gulf Coast into the world's largest construction site. And the rebuilding was being done by migrant workers. My days would start at 5:30 in the morning under a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee. And underneath
Hello everyone, I'm Neil Wilkins and I lead the Migrant Workers Programme at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. Our programme seeks to promote the rights of migrant workers at all stages of the migration cycle. Like many others, however, we of course have a particular focus on how migrant workers are recruited, as we see in all sectors and all locations that flawed recruitment processes frequently sow the seeds of vulnerability that can lead to exploitation. As part of the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment 2023, I'm joined today by Saket Soni, who is a labour rights activist in the USA, working especially for the rights of low-wage migrant workers across the United States. Saket is also the author of a book, The Great Escape, a true story of forced labour and immigrant dreams in America. It's a great book and one that I thoroughly recommend. And I'm delighted to have Saket with me today. Saket, welcome.
Thank you, Neil. Great to be here with you.
Saket, I think the title, The Great Escape, gives us an idea of what your book is about. But perhaps you can give us an overview of the Great Escape and immigrant dreams in America.
Sure. The Great Escape is about how I helped 500 men who arrived in the United States after Hurricane Katrina escape from forced labor and get on a road to justice. Um, I'm a labor rights organizer, and after Hurricane Katrina, I ran a small labor rights nonprofit. Um, you know, this was in 2005. Katrina and the post-Katrina flooding had turned the Gulf Coast into the world's largest construction site, and the rebuilding was being done by migrant workers. My days would start at 5:30 in the morning under 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee. And underneath that statue, black and brown workers, mostly migrant workers, would gather looking for work. And I'd watch as contractors came in on buses and picked them up and took them out to the distant corners of the Gulf Coast to rebuild, to carry out the reconstruction. I try to protect workers as I could. That's what I was doing when I got a mysterious midnight phone call from a man who was too scared to tell me his name, but clearly was from India. This was followed by 2 other anonymous calls, and I convinced these workers to meet me. They would only speak to me anonymously, and they refused to meet in person at first. But then I convinced them to meet me clandestinely, and they picked a location that they said was the secret Catholic church in Mississippi, in Pascagoula, Mississippi. It took a drive through Mississippi to find it. In their particular English, the secret Catholic church was actually the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And when I got there, I had my hand on the doorknob and my heart was racing. I expected to meet 3 workers in the back room of a church. I opened the door, and it turned out there were 100 workers waiting there. It turned out they were part of a group of 500 Indian workers who were recruited on false pretenses, brought to the U.S. Gulf Coast, and put into labor camps and subjected to forced labor as they built oil rigs for a large Gulf Coast based oil rig manufacturer. These workers, I found out, were brought to the United States on promises of green cards and good jobs. They were charged by recruiters $20,000 a piece for doing so. $20,000, at the time and now in India, is an extraordinary sum for an ordinary person. This represents a lifetime of savings. Men sold ancestral lands. They put homes on the hawk. They had their parents empty their pensions. They sold family jewelry. And when they arrived, they found themselves working round the clock shifts behind barbed wire fences. They found themselves living 24 people to a room in trailers that made up labor camps on company property. They paid $1,000 a piece a month additionally in rent for the privilege of living there. They were surveilled night and day, and they were given frozen rice to eat as they did backbreaking work for this company. And worst of all, the promises of green cards turned out to be false. There were never any green cards. The men arrived on temporary visas and were not free to leave their employment situation and the man camps that the company put them in. So what happens in the book is, I meet these men, stumble upon one of the largest human trafficking cases in modern U.S. history. And in the middle of the book, the workers and I engineer a great escape, the great escape of the title. What follows after that is part government conspiracy thriller, part freedom journey. The Great Escape itself is something out of a heist movie. I don't want to give too much away, but involves a lot of wild turkey whiskey and flavored cigars as bribes for the guards, and a fictitious Indian wedding as a pretext to get 500 men out from under the noses in the middle of the night of the guards around the labor camp. And then the men set out on a freedom journey and are up against government spies and corporate greed. And the book follows how they wind up at the gates of the Department of Justice in Washington.
Saket, that's great. And you refer there to the title of the book, which is, of course, is The Great Escape, and that clearly refers to the workers getting away from this situation of exploitation that they found themselves trapped in. But perhaps it's also a reference to the other things that migrant workers seek to escape from, or at least work through. And that's to do with family expectations, economic pressures, lack or limited opportunities, but also things like the desire for more and dreams of adventure. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I was writing this book, I thought about the way most people receive stories of migrants and immigrants. Most people get those stories from the news, and in the news, here in the United States and probably around the world, in the news, migrant workers and migrants in general either need to be either have problems to be solved, or they are the problem. They're either victims to be rescued or political problems for entire nations. You look at what's happening in Greece now and how the EU is dealing with the migrant problem, not looking at migrants themselves as complex human beings. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to look at the subjects of this book, the migrants in this book, as people with a lot of complexity. So, people who have desires and dreams, and who have good days and bad days, who maybe have parents or kids that they love but they can't stand on certain days, and who have their own dreams. So, for example, and I should say, one of the ways I decided to do that was to focus on their love stories. The way into this book is the love stories of these characters. So you, for example, have one of the protagonists of this book is a man named Ebbi Raju. Ebbi is a young man in India. He's a 20-something motorcycle riding young welder whose biggest problem before he's trafficked to the United States of America is that his mother is trying to drag him into an arranged marriage. He just doesn't want it. He's in India for a short time. He wants to get back out there to Bahrain, where he's been working. He wants to work more so that he can afford his parents a retirement. And, he's a young guy. He wants to date. He wants to see the world. Well, his mother won't have it. And she's advertised in the matrimonial pages of the local newspaper that her son is an eligible bachelor. Well, Ebby's, kicking and screaming, but then he accidentally winds up on a phone call with the woman that his mother has chosen as his bride-to-be. And he hears her voice. And upon hearing her voice, he just falls in love with her. He hadn't planned to, but now he's in love, and he has a new problem, which is he wants to go to America, but he also wants to marry this girl. And so I'll read to you from a moment in the book where Ebby has already been betrothed to this woman, and then has gotten on a phone call with her and has fallen in love with her. So he's now agreed to the marriage, but he's trying to figure out how to tell her that he needs to go to America. Their sanctioned courtship started after the marriage was set. A courtship conducted entirely by phone, each call a bite from a stolen mango. Bincy rang Ebby every day. He always picked up in the middle of some new wedding preparation, shirtless painting the house, erecting a billowing tent in the gale, firing up a cauldron to braise a goat. She asked about his hobbies. He couldn't come up with any. What about her? She liked to sing. Would she sing for him now? Of course not. Singing was for church. Later, she slipped out of the house to a shady coconut grove and sang him an Adventist praise song. When she was finished, she was quite abashed and hung up. One phone call, one praise song at a time, they fell in love. And as they did, Ebby's dilemma grew. How to tell his bride-to-be he would be leaving her right after the wedding. There had been challenges to the green card plan, but Ebby had pushed through. His father's bank had refused them a loan against his house, but then the local recruiter helped them find another. With that money and his father's savings, and his mother's jewelry, and cash from relatives, Ebby had just under $15,000. The rest came from a moneylender. The American lawyer put in their visa application. He couldn't tell Bincy on the phone, and he was forbidden from seeing her in person before the wedding. He decided to pay her a clandestine visit on a day he knew she'd be alone. He rode up to her house and called her. As usual, she answered immediately. How are you? Where are you? Look outside. He waved to her from his motorcycle. She gave a squeal of delight, then caught herself and switched to a scandalized tone. You can't be here. I've brought food. Biryani, mutton curry. She ordered him home. He argued. She scolded back. Eventually, he relented, laughing, and rode off. He hadn't made it to her door, but he was glowing from the rendezvous. Then it hit him. He'd forgotten all about telling her.
Thank you, Saket. And I think that that's just illustrated a great strength of the book, that it doesn't just present this group of workers as yet more hapless victims who get tricked and cheated by a range of people, from recruitment agents to the company employing them to the US government. Instead, the book paints a very vivid picture of their individual lives, and often those of their partners and families, like you've just explained, all of them waiting expectantly at home. And you clearly became very close to many of these workers.
Yeah, one of the things that sustained me through a very difficult campaign was the friendships I built with these men. So, for example, Ebby Raju, the character I just read about, he and I continue to be friends. One of, at the beginning of the book, when I meet these workers, it's clear that they have problems, but we all share a major problem, which is how to get 500 men out of Mississippi and Texas labor camps in the middle of the night, how to engineer the Great Escape. And the way that happened was through a friendship. I met a worker named Rajan. He was deep inside the Mississippi labor camp. Um, my initial meeting with those 100 men ended disastrously. I couldn't promise them anything. The meeting broke up. The men streamed away. But then this one man, Rajan, reached out to me, and he and I built a friendship. We were very uneasy allies at first. I was from a liberal North Indian family, from a New Delhi family that was, really liberal. In fact, my parents might have been the only parents in the history of India to let their kid go to the United States to study theater. That's how liberal my parents were. Meanwhile, Rajan was from a conservative South Indian family that came from an ancient warrior clan. Rajan was scandalized at my lifestyle in the United States. The fact that I didn't have a temple at home, an altar at home for prayers. The fact that I dated and hadn't married an Indian woman. The fact that I ate steak. He would tell me that's a sin, and I would say only if you order it well done. And we would fight about that. But over the course of time, we struck a real deep friendship. And that friendship really was the basis of building the entire campaign, The Great Escape, at the center of the book. The friendship also sustained us on the journey that came after The Great Escape. The pressure was building for the men. They were now out of work and undocumented and marching on foot from New Orleans to Washington. And meanwhile, at home, moneylenders were circling their families. Rajan and I really helped the men keep their resolve. Our strategy was that, coming out of the labor camps, we had filed an allegation of human trafficking to the Department of Justice. And we expected that the Justice Department would open an investigation, send law enforcement officials, and grant these workers the special humanitarian status that comes with work permits accorded to migrants who are victims of trafficking while the investigation was open. Instead, the Department of Justice didn't open an investigation, and there was an initial call from the FBI that didn't come. And then we were out in the cold. So we started marching towards Washington for an answer, not knowing that deep inside the government, there were secret, deals and agents with their own corrupt ties to the company. And the pressures like that, those kinds of pressures, sadly, really wound up, in a heartbreaking way, ending my friendship with Rajan. And that's also the great tragedy kind of towards the end of the book, is that under his own pressure, Rajan turned on the campaign and turned on me, and I mourned the death of a friendship.
Yeah, and it comes across in all of the pages about the friendship that you have with Rajan, and the time toll and the toll on everyone who was a part of this campaign. One of the recurring themes throughout the book is food, and in particular the food of the Indian workers' homeland, which is often described in great detail. Why did you see this as an important part of telling the workers' story?
It was so deeply important at the time, and it's a deep part of the book. It started in the labor camps. These 500 men came from places with extraordinary food, and then they were in a labor camp where they were given frozen rice to eat, which they sucked to warm it up before they could swallow it, or at best stale bread or stale pizza. The way we started to hatch the plot to help the men escape started with food. I would smuggle Indian ingredients into the labor camps for Rajan. Rajan would commandeer the kitchen in the labor camps, and he would start to cook up these extraordinary, simple but extraordinary meals. A simple dal, yellow lentils collapsed into a soupy mix, stirred with cumin and oil. And these flavors and smells in the labor camp woke the men up from their catatonic hopelessness, from their state, and it revived their hopes. Those meals were the occasion for Rajan to recruit them into talking to me. Then he ferried the men out from the labor camp, 5, 6 at a time, to secret meetings in a hotel room where I would meet with them. And at that meeting, I brought Indian food for the men to eat. When we escaped and on our way to Washington, whenever Rajan and I had major problems to solve, we would solve them over food. The biggest problem came in Washington, D.C., when, the counter campaign run by the company and its lobbyists and allies, framed us as a special interest group. And meanwhile, secret agents inside the government, people who had their own relationship with the company and their own self-interests, cast the workers as the criminals, not victims of trafficking, but criminals out to defraud the U.S. government. And as we saw our support, evaporating in Washington, Rajan and I solved that problem over a meal. And there's a scene in the book that features Rajan and I in a kitchen, and Rajan teaching me how to cook a mouth-watering meal, a kind of one pot meal of rice and chicken, a kind of a Bedouin version of biryani that involves 22 spices, and the Rajan lifts up the lid, and there's this unbelievable fragrant steam rising from the pot. And over this mouth-watering meal, Rajan and I realized that the next step of the campaign, after the Great Escape and a 14-day march to Washington, the next step is a hunger strike. And so renouncing food becomes the most important thing that these men do, to show that theirs is a moral struggle, not a political self-interest, or a tactic. So food played such an important part of the book because it played such an important role in the men's lives.
Great. And, some of the descriptions are certainly mouth-watering, and I can understand how important this is to workers so far away from home, from everything that they hold dear, and we can easily see that place, the food and the tastes and smells of home, the things that those conjure up for people. The workers, the majority of the workers were able to resolve their cases successfully with the US government, and many of them were granted the right to remain in the US. I know that you're still in touch with many of the workers that took part in this struggle. Can you tell us a little about their lives now?
Yes, we're a deep part of each other's lives. The book, and I don't think this is a spoiler. This is a rare migrant workers story that ends well. At the end of the book, the men are reunited with their spouses and families, children. There's a gorgeous scene at the end of the book where Ebi Raju, that young welder, 3 years later, he's reunited with his wife, and his wife was pregnant when Ebi left for the United States. So he's also reunited with his 3-year-old son. So at the end of the book, Ebi is standing in the Atlanta airport waiting for his wife Bincy and his 3-year-old son to arrive. And he's wondering whether his son will come into his arms because he's never met his father. So Ebi's carrying a little toy for his son, a small yellow JVC excavator, and he sees Bincy's head pop from above the escalator, and Binsi runs to him, and Ebby nervously hands his son the excavator, but his son doesn't want it. His son just leaps into his arms. So that's the scene of reunion at the end of the book. Ebby and I continue to be friends after that scene. We wound up at his house, his new little apartment that he had fixed up for Binsi and his son. Binsi cooked this extraordinary meal for us to commemorate, the beginning of her new life with her husband. And Binsi and Ebby went on to become citizens of the United States. They are now voting in elections. Ebby and I went to India a few months ago to meet his extended family in India. So in a beautiful way, the workers and I are in each other's lives. We're friends, and they're now joining unions. Sending their kids to college. In fact, I got a call from one of the workers the other day, a man named Shaukat, who's right at the heart of the book, and he said just weeks ago, he said, "Saketji, I have something to tell you. The campaign is over. We finally won our campaign." And I said, "Well, that was a few years ago, right?" He said, No. Victory just happened, this week, because my oldest daughter just got into 5 American medical schools. So these workers, the way they see it, the real rewards of our campaign are not for them. It's for their children, who are now receiving their own, accolades and on their own journey. That's the real victory of the campaign.
Thank you. And that's the migrant dream, isn't it? How do we do better? How do we do better, especially for our kids? Saket, just moving on. The workers in this story originally came to the USA to work as part of cleanup operations following Hurricane Katrina in 2009. And I think that we can all see that the unfolding climate crisis will inevitably see more of these natural disasters, hurricanes, flooding, wildfires, etc., occurring. And we might also include reconstruction after conflicts such as that going on in Ukraine at the moment. Now, you've now founded an organization called Resilience Force. Can you tell us a little about that and what you hope to achieve?
Yeah, what I didn't know at the time when I met these workers, was that they were just the first among many, many workers who would emerge as the labor force that is repairing homes and schools and cities and entire economies after climate disaster. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was supposed to have been a once in 100-year event. Since Hurricane Katrina, we've seen over $200 billion disasters in the United States, disasters that have caused $1 billion of damage or more. And all of that damage is being repaired by migrant workers. So in the decade after Hurricane Katrina, each time there was a flood or a fire or a tornado or hurricane, the same workers who rebuilt the Gulf Coast would then go following storm after storm to rebuild and repair. And each time they would call me, they'd say, "Come here and help us. You can't believe what's happening to us." And I would go. And it turned out over the course of a decade, these workers have acquired incredible skill and a deep sense of vocation around their work. So we've given them a name. We call them the Resilience Workforce. They are the United States' white blood cells. They are the people who do repairs and make recovery possible after climate disasters. And Resilience Force is, their national voice. We're the voice of these workers, and we protect them. And right now, these workers are mostly undocumented, mostly migrants. They're mostly unprotected and vulnerable. But also, there aren't enough of them. What we really need in the climate change era is a resilience workforce of millions. That's part of what we're doing, is building a millions strong workforce to rebuild and repair at scale in an era of climate disasters. these workers are also rebuilding social cohesion. A lot of times you have immigrants building the homes of people who thought they hated immigrants until a flood came, and then they were relying on these immigrants. You often have these immigrants going into conservative areas where politically the most important electoral issue was building a wall to keep them out, until a hurricane came and the most important issue became, rebuilding homes and schools and keeping the tax base. So we're at work building the bonds and lasting friendships between migrants and the U.S. born, between the workers and their beneficiaries, so that those friendships can be a source of true resilience.
I think that we saw very similar during COVID, of course, with key workers, the nurses, the care home assistants, the dust cart men, all of these people who kept our vital services going at some risk to themselves during these disasters. And I think that the other point is that, even though we use the word crisis to describe these situations, that's not an excuse to suspend normal labour rights and other associated sort of international standards. And so are there any specific recommendations that you'd like to make in dealing with the aftermath of these disasters? How can governments and businesses react when these things happen? And what is the best way to protect these very vital workforces?
Well, I think it's just what you said. The sense of emergency and the sense of crisis has been used all too often as an opportunity to suspend labor rights, to cut costs by, putting 8 people in a room instead of 2 in a cleanup site, or to say, well, we don't have, we don't have the luxury right now to raise wages. In fact, we need to reduce wages. And instead of that, what we really need to do is look at disasters and their aftermath as a reason for bolstering labor rights, a reason for for making sure the workforce on whom recovery depends, that workforce and all of its members are safe and secure. Because disasters reveal that we live in an interdependent world. We depend on these workers. During the pandemic here in the US and probably around the world, we were going out into the streets or up on our balconies on Friday nights, and we were applauding for essential workers. The sounds of clapping would rain down, in cities like New York and Chicago. In New Delhi, people would go up with pots and pans and clang, to express their gratitude. And gratitude is important. It was really important that there was recognition for the essential workers who kept us going. But gratitude isn't enough. People also needs rights and respect and union contracts and and a chance to protect themselves from the raging pandemic or whatever other emergency. For businesses in particular, what I see all the time is there's 2 kinds of businesses after disaster. There's the businesses that want to get on the high road and they need help. They want to treat workers well because they understand that their workforce is the key to their business. The only competitive advantage they have is a reliable, ready workforce that is skilled and trained and can carry out the work, of recovering from an emergency. And they want to do right by their workers and they're guided by values. Those are the high road businesses. But we all have a responsibility to make sure those businesses have incentives to stay on the high road. Instead, what you have is a world where the high road businesses can be undercut anytime by the low road businesses, the ones who don't pay well, the ones who cut costs, the ones who are only too happy to steal wages or make promises to attract workers and then pay, much less than they offered. And as long as that's allowed, the rules of the marketplace will be that the low road actors will always win, will always get the next contract, will always have a competitive advantage, while the high road contractors or businesses, don't know how to stay in business. So we really have a responsibility to have to keep a framework where there's as much incentives to stay on the high road and as many punishments for the low road actors, so that it's no longer good business practice, to undercut market competition by treating workers badly.
I think the point you make is one that's very well made, and it's always important to remember that decent labour rights that are effectively and consistently enforced don't just protect workers, they also protect law-abiding business that's trying to do the right thing. And we see that in all of our work across the world. I think that the things that we can all see that the things you describe are going to become even more necessary as we learn to live in a world where these environmental shocks become more frequent. It's clearly vital that we try to establish some common standards for these situations, and crisis cannot be used to overturn hard-won labour and human rights. The workers involved in the reconstruction and rebuilding that's needed are effectively key workers, essential workers. All the more reason to treat them with respect and dignity. Saket, thank you for speaking to me today. It really is much appreciated. And Saket's book, The Great Escape, A True Story of Forced Labour and Immigrant Dreams in America, is available in all good bookstores. And you can find more about his organisation Resilience Force at the link on the screen. Thank you, Saket, very much.
Thank you, Neil. Great to be with you.
Bye.